Welcome to 52 Miniatures. My name is Alex. I'm on a boat somewhere in the North Sea. Perfectly normal, but I put myself in a bit of a tight spot. I've only brought 3 colors to paint my miniature, and it doesn't really look like I can go outside and buy some more. And so this video will be about the potential benefits or pitfalls of painting with only a few colors. I want to say straight off the bat that this video is not about advanced color theory. I'm well aware that most of us paint little plastic toy soldiers to the best of our ability, and that art school shouldn't have to come into the equation. There will be some theory, simple explanations of what I'm doing, but my goal is to find other points of interest that can be applicable to all, including the inexperienced. For any expert commentary, please go to art school. I never did. I have been thinking, though, not about going to art school, but about other existential matters. The wind and the sound of the waves crashing against the hull can do that to a person. In recent videos, I've been using a lot of paints, and I thought, what am I showing people? Ways to paint miniatures, or just the need to go out and buy more paint? So I set up this little predicament for myself on a boat, limited to 3 colors, plus a black and a white, to see what is doable. Is there more to limiting your palette than the obvious hassle of having to mix paint all the time? Let's get the basics out of the way and then see. Limited palettes can be pretty much anything. Avid artists can have very specialized choices of paint, like the famous Sawn palette. But very common is to use blue, yellow and red, 3 primary colors, plus black and white. I think a lot of us painting minis view mixing paint as something of a mystery. But if you travel back in your mind to days long gone, I'm sure there is a primary school memory in there somewhere of having some red still on your brush when going in to get that yellow to paint the pretty sun in the sky, furiously realizing you now made orange and that sunset was not part of the plan. Or even worse, going straight from the black to the yellow, and now your sun is a dark green color. We're doing the same thing here, only now we know that dark green can be used for orcs, and so it's okay. Before boarding my boat, I performed this little primary school exercise on my wet palette, trying out different combinations of paint, settling in the end for a scarlet red, an ultramarine blue, and a yellow iron oxide as my 3 primary paints. Using a regular yellow would have created more vivid colors, but I enjoy this rather muted style. As you can see, I can mix a variety of colors, shades of green, apricot, pink, purple. Mixing my 3 original paints can also make different shades of gray as well as brown. Organizing the paints in a circle like this, a color wheel, if you will, on the palette makes for a more visual and organized experience. Taking a picture of this palette to keep as reference means I can plan my paint job a bit better, knowing what I have to work with without actually having to mix all the paints every single time I sit down to paint. As for the miniature, I'm going to paint my Yndrasta, a hero for the Stormcast faction from Warhammer Age of Sigmar that I've spiced up. I kitbashed this great miniature a while back, and she's now Yndrasta the Gladiator. I'm excited. I've wanted to paint her for some time, regardless of boat situations. I've zenithal primed this model, priming black and then dusting with a white spray from above to create this black and white effect that makes her look like she's lit from a cloudy sky. I use this zenithal prime as a light map, intending to paint brighter paints on brighter areas and darker paints in the shaded areas. I decided on a yellow tan armor based on the yellow iron oxide paint. As I started painting, you can see I use wet blending, a technique of mixing paint on the miniature while it's still wet. It became apparent that the most natural thing was to mix in a cool paint in the shadows and the warm yellow on the highlights. Outdoor shadows are often cool, right? And because I had the color wheel thing going on my palette, this kind of happened automatically. And so I got this blue to green to tan yellow thing going that looked really good. If I would have had access to all my paints back home, I would probably have picked out 3 shades of yellowish, from something brown to yellow to pale yellow. But what I got here was far more dramatic and interesting. Whatever did not fit into the yellow category on this fierce warrior are painted with a pale blue and some white, thinking that further along the line this will have to represent some kind of silvery metal. For the cloak, I used the scarlet red muted down with a bit of black and yellow. In the shadows, I again mixed in a bit of blue and rendering a purple vibe. I had issues with proper coverage here, I'll talk more about that later. But I kept on slapping on paint, intent on getting 1 layer of paint on everything on the model before paying attention to detail. I find it helps immensely sketching out all the color scheme ideas and blocks of colors, including painting the base, before worrying too much about what's actually going on. With paint in place over the entire miniature, creative decisions are far easier for me, and what might have appeared to have been a mistake might not matter too much in the grand scheme of things. To make this experiment more interesting, I asked Signe to paint a miniature using the same paints as me. She has so far painted 1 full miniature. This will be her second. So she is as much a beginner as it gets. And she's not into the hobbies, so she's also not set in her ways when it comes to how paint is broadly approached in our niche. Not only is it great to have a painting companion on the boat, I also thought it would be fun to see how she would approach the limited paint selection. Signe has a good eye for colors and is what you would call comfortable in the creative realm, but by no means more of a painter than the rest of us. She hasn't been to art school either. For her, I prepared a Kroot, on the basis that Kroot are cool. It was zenithal primed like my Yndrasta, and lo and behold, the limitation of paints meant nothing. Signe would ask me some questions like, do these things have a specific skin color? Or more commonly, what's that little thing there? Most often, my answer would be, I think it's another weapon, ammo or grenade. Then she would mix around the paints on the palette until satisfied. I spotted all kinds of colors, highlights and shadows on her palette and never a single question on how to mix paint. I guess because in the end it's rather obvious. It's all happening right there in front of your eyes. As I got off the boat, I thought maybe I could just find a little more paint. I mean, just a bit of more vibrant yellow to spice things up, or some contrast paints or washes for all those little crevices and small details on the huge mechanical wings. But it seemed like I stepped off on the wrong island for that kind of stuff. Even in the not-so-metropolis of Torshavn was I in luck. Lots of picturesque views, but the closest I got to nerd heaven was a bookstore selling some D&D books and minis and magic cards. And so I had to accept my self-inflicted path and keep painting Yndrasta with what I brought along. What I did do, however, was visit the National Art Gallery of the Faroe Islands. I know, that was an arty thing to say. But maybe someone had left me a tube of yellow paint lying around. I walked around pondering limited color schemes and limited palettes and found a few works of art that resonated. To my untrained eye, these paintings, or shall I say gift shop postcard copies of paintings, are examples of artists using a limited set of paints. Apart from the art itself, the obvious artistic excellence, there is a sense of coherency, of unity. All the colors resonate with each other and belong together. We're a long way away from painting 50 miniatures with olive green for World War II bolt action here, I know, but I think I'm on to something. I set up a new paint station, by the way. Traveling with less paint is really nice, if you ever find yourself in that situation. But don't expect to get any straight answers from the passing sheep of where one can buy a nice vibrant yellow acrylic paint. Anyway, while I continue to paint on the base layers on Yndrasta, I'd like to talk about my revelations. Using only a few colors and mixing them to create more hues means that almost all the colors on the miniature have paint in common. My yellowish armor has a little of the other 2 main colors in it, my red cloak as well. My brown tree has all the 3 main colors in it, and so on. And in the end, whatever I do, there is a coherency happening that makes everything look nice together. This without me actually having to actively think too much about how the different colors will look next to each other. And it turned out easier to get a coherent color scheme by using colors mixed this way. Easier than it usually is when having to choose pre-mixed colors from my rack of paints. Next revelation. The world isn't always lots of small sections of variously bright colors, or 7 different style ammo pouches all in various shades of brown, or gold trim on blue pauldrons. Sometimes it's not many colors at all, yet still utterly spectacular. By limiting my choice of paint, I subconsciously created a simpler color scheme, not bothering so much with all the possibilities of painting all the little things in different colors. Honestly, just because of the simple reason that I couldn't be bothered mixing that much. When having many paints to choose from, I tend to complicate things just because I can. Another revelation. This time, back on the boat. Thinking inspiring thoughts of the art I'd seen at the art gallery and the nature that had surrounded me, I sought the feeling of looking at one coherent piece. I decided to make sure all the shadows on the Mini were of a similar tone. It would kind of make sense that the shadows on the stone steps had a similar color as the shadows on the armor, for example, as they would both be shaded under the same sky. I was already halfway there with my wet blending of cooler colors into the shadows, but I wanted to exaggerate the effect. I mixed my blue and yellow oxide with some black, realizing I most probably recreated the shade of the ocean that had entranced me on the Faroe Islands for almost 2 weeks. I watered this mix down to a thin paint, we could probably call it a glaze, and started painting it into the shaded areas. This tied everything together beautifully, and I was honestly a little surprised how well it worked. Again, I got reminded of the fact that probably all my colors, already in place, have some of the very same blue and yellow pigments in them. Thus, this shadow color did not look out of place wherever I added it. I could now work on the final details and edge highlights. Mixing my paints was no hassle now. I'd pretty much learned what to do by heart. For all the highlights, I tried to add not only white, but also yellow, oxide, and a little red, creating warmer highlights to contrast the cooler shadows. So how about some of the cons of working with a limited palette like this? When mixing paint like I've done, it's beneficial to use single pigment paints, a type of paint not very common in our hobby realm, but pretty much the standard way to buy paint in the traditional art realm. I know very little about the process of making hobby paints, but from what I can tell, all our little bottles contain not only mixes of different pigments to create all the different colors, they also often contain white and/or black. And so when mixing hobby brand paints, we're not only mixing colors together, often we are invertedly adding gray and stuff like that. Desaturating as we go, with the possibility of creating dull, washed out colors when mixing a lot. This doesn't happen with single pigment paints. But buying single pigment paints, I've been using golden so-flat paints and scale color artist paints, is a jungle in itself because of how these single pigments act. Different pigments cover by varying degree. Some are more transparent than others. I had, for example, inadvertently chosen 3 relatively transparent pigments. It turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise, as it made my Zenithal Prime shine through that first layer and things looked nice, fast. But if I would have primed black, you would have heard my anguished screams echo across the North Sea when trying to get some kind of coverage going. The worst coverage was the scarlet red, where I had to actually go in and underpaint with white in the highlights to be able to get a bright red happening. And so using single pigment paints requires research. The knowledge learned can be beneficial, but it's not as simple as using hobby paints. Lines of paint like AK Interactive and Pro Acryl are rather consistent across the range and will cover well regardless of color, even on a black primed surface. If you're batch painting a lot of similar models, paint mixing will be a hassle, unless you prepare. Olive drab, khaki, and German field grey are not the most fun colors to continue having to mix. But if you're serious about it, there's several ways of keeping journal on how to mix your paints, or even bottling premixes of your most used mixes. But frankly, all of this is a little boring and not the reason I think should be the basis of a good versus bad discussion. I'm not sure we should have one at all now that I think about it. This video has a provocative title. Using less paint will make you a better painter. Nothing I've painted on Yndrasta is reserved for a limited palette. It can be done as well with regular hobby paints. But using a limited palette, even just for this one miniature, has opened a few doors for me. Some have been technical, but mainly it's been about looking at paint as actual colors and not just bottles with cool names on them telling me what they should be used for. Honestly, I feel like I've been using a tool as it's meant to be used. Painting has decided the outcome, not the paint. Like I'm the one deciding and not the paint, or the paint brand. And because of that, what I've learned is something I can apply to any paint job, limited palette or not. I think that if you do this same exercise, you will become a better painter, just for the same reason. Signe was a little bit disappointed with her miniature in the end, the kind of disappointment that comes to most beginners, the feeling that the mini lacks punch, depth and definition. But man, is that one coherent-looking crude color scheme. It makes me wonder what things would look like if hobby brands never would have started making all the different paints. If money was not made by selling us hundreds of bottles to paint our little minis, and we would from the start have been limited to mixing our own. Maybe not as many minis would have been painted because of the steep entry level. The colorblind sure would miss the specific labels and descriptive names. Painting tutorials on YouTube would be harder to follow, that's for sure. Or maybe we would all find our own style and inner artist, now blocked by the utter wall of pre-produced triads. One can only speculate. Yndrasta is ready for the battlefield, and she doesn't really care about all this. Her voyage is just beginning where mine is ending. She has many a foe to smite, and I'm thinking about getting my hands on one of those big boxes of paint from the army painter. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you try and pick out some paints and try painting with a limited palette. You don't need to go buy single pigment paints if you don't have them. Just experiment a bit with what you've got. If you enjoyed this voyage on the sea of hobby madness, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It's only through the support of my patrons that I can continue to justify carrying camera gear up the jagged slopes of faraway islands and trying to paint minis while crashing through the waves of the North Sea. Thank you for watching. Bye.